Hello and welcome to our next text talk for the week of August 2nd, 2020. For today, we'll take a look at Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 to 21, which is Jesus feeding the 5,000, a very important text. And so we'll take a look at that text today and we'll really flesh it out. So again, join me in Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 to 21, and we'll walk through the text and point out some helpful things along the way. So let's take a look at verse 13 then. Now when Jesus heard this, he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place by himself. And so let's walk through this verse. Now when Jesus heard this, what is this? Well, it's the context immediately preceding this verse, which is the death of his cousin John the Baptist. John the Baptist is brutally murdered in prison. He is beheaded because of the request of an evil woman, Herodias, Herod's brother's wife, Philip. She had married King Herod, and after her daughter had done a pleasing dance for a party that was going on with King Herod, Herod said, I'll give you anything that you want, up to half of my kingdom. And so her mother then tells her daughter, give me John the Baptist's head on a platter. So, having said this promise in front of his guests, he does so. And so then verse 12, and his disciples came and took the body and buried it, and they went and told Jesus. And so Jesus then hears this distressing news, this terrible news. His cousin has been brutally murdered, and he withdrew from there in a boat to a desolate place. In Greek, that's a fun word. It's ermon topon, which means literally like a desert place, so an uninhabited place, like it said in the text, a desolate place. And so that's the setting for this text. And so Jesus wants to go be by himself, probably to grieve, probably to pray, to get some rest and some quiet. It's never easy losing a loved one, and so Jesus wants to go be by himself with his disciples, but not so fast. But when the crowds heard it, they followed him on foot from the other towns. The Sea of Galilee is by no means a large lake. It's very long and narrow, but it's not very wide. At its widest point, it's really only about 8 miles wide. So it's pretty easy to see people you know on such a small, narrow lake. You probably can identify the people you know up north at the lake that you go to. But, so they see Jesus and his disciples in the boat, and so what do? Well, they then hurry down around to where he's going to land, where he's going to disembark. And at this point, you really have to feel bad for Jesus, don't you? He wants to grieve. He wants to be by himself. And then what happens is that he's bombarded by people. And so that would be enough to make anyone go, you know what, guys? Not today. Go back home. I need some peace and quiet. It's enough to make anyone be maybe angry or mad or resentful, for them to kind of make nagging comments or to be a little passive aggressive, like, I would help you, but I've been interrupted during my quiet time, or, I just don't have the strength to do anything. I got interrupted, right? But Jesus does none of that. So verse 14, when he went ashore, he saw a great crowd, and he had compassion on them, and he healed their sick. And so people have needs in this crowd, and Jesus doesn't turn them away. And so he puts his own needs on the back burner, and he heals these people. And so this seems then to go on for a while. And then we have verse 15. Now when it was evening, the disciples came to him and said, this is a desolate or a desert place, and the day is now over. Send the crowds away to go into the villages and buy food for themselves. And in a sense, their request seems a little calculated. It makes sense, right? They can't provide for these people, but it also seems a little cold too, right? They say, let's get them out of here. The food issue is their problem. What can they really do about it? And so the disciples say, let's just send them away. Let's get this show on the road. Let's go home. And again, remember the context is kind of a significant setting for this miracle. It's a desert place, right? It's uninhabited. And so it then brings to mind God's miraculous feedings in the Old Testament. You think of people wandering in the desert, or some of the feedings that the prophets did as well. And so the gears are turning in the minds of Matthew's hearers. The gears are turning in the minds of that Jewish audience. It's getting to set the scene for things God has done in the past and how he will do them again in Jesus Christ. And so then Jesus says, they need not go away. You give them something to eat. And can you imagine being a disciple here at this moment? Jesus says, why don't you feed this crowd of over 5,000 people? You'd probably be thinking, you're joking. You can't do this in a modern setting, let alone an ancient one. And so you'd have to wonder what is going through their minds at this point. They're probably hoping he just can't be serious, right? And so they said to him, we have only 5 loaves here and 2 fish. It's really not a lot of food. That's not enough for the 12 disciples, let alone 5,000 plus people. And so then Jesus says in 18, bring them here to me. I think it's a wonderful point to bring out that what may not seem like a lot is actually a lot in God's hands. We might think we're very unequipped or not up for the task that God has for us, or we might think we just don't have a lot, but that really couldn't be any farther from the truth. A little in Jesus' hands is a lot. That's something we can take great comfort in. And we see that in the following verses. Then he ordered the crowds to sit down on the grass. Kind of makes you think of Psalm 23, right? And taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, he looked up to heaven and said a blessing. So kind of like the common table prayer. Then he broke the loaves and gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the crowds. And so Jesus takes command of the situation. He has the people sit down. He does a prayer, gives the stuff to the disciples, and the disciples then give the food to the crowd. And then verse 20, and they all ate and were satisfied. So really think about that. Jesus is generous here. He gives an abundance. He doesn't just give a small or set amount, 1 loaf, 1 fish. That's it for everybody. Instead, they have all that they want. And they're completely full and satisfied. There's an abundance here. And then it says in 20 as well, and then they took up 12 baskets full of the broken pieces left over. And think about that number 12 for a second. That's pretty significant, isn't it? That would be 1 basket for each disciple. They were each individually able to see the miraculous feeding here. Each had their own basket, in a sense, to see the abundance that God here provides. And so then, verse 21, and those who ate were about 5,000 men besides women and children. And so really, in a sense, then, this text should be called the feeding of the 5,000 plus, right? It was just 5,000 men that were counted, not including women and children. And so the word here for men is a little ambiguous. It doesn't necessarily mean married men in particular, but I think it wouldn't be far off to assume that most of them were probably married, and that those who were married probably had at least one kid. So at the very least, I think you can safely say Jesus fed over 10,000 people, if not 15,000 people. If it was just a family of 4, and that's assuming all were, that would be 20,000. So Jesus fed over 5,000 people. It's really a miracle that's great and grand in scope. And so we see here in this text our Lord's compassion. He has compassion on their needs, and he has compassion on our needs. We see the abundance that Jesus provides. And we see the abundance that he provides in our lives, things both in body. We're really blessed to live here in America, and also the abundance of the things he gives us in soul, right? His forgiveness, his love, his life. And so we see those two themes here, compassion and abundance. And Jesus gives those things in full, right? And so two other things that kind of point out here in our text are, is one actually two parallels. So the first is this, is that this is the only miracle besides the resurrection that is recorded in all 4 Gospels. Think about that for a second. It really shows the scope and importance of this miracle. That besides the resurrection, this is the other miracle that is recorded. It shows just how important this was to those early Christians. It shows how beloved it was to those early Christians. And so it's a miracle that shows us God's abundance along with his compassion, foreshadowing the cross and the resurrection and the abundant life and grace we receive from it. Another interesting parallel is the parallel it has with communion. So take a look then at verse 19 and 20. You see broke, gave, and these are some of the words that are used in the accounts for the Lord's Supper. So Jesus is not doing the Lord's Supper here, but it certainly makes a nice parallel, a nice pointing ahead to the Lord's Supper and how through the Lord's Supper we get that abundance of grace, right? You have this bread and this wine that give more than what meets the eye, gives Christ's body and blood, and how this body and blood is given for the entire world. And it's also interesting to point out here too, is that the word for leftovers is the word klasmaton, which is often used in early Christian liturgies as a reference to the breaking of the bread in communion. And so you have this word that's used for the leftovers that's also used, like I said, in early Christian liturgies for the Lord's Supper. So all the way back, even within the first century, you see this especially in the Didache, which is again in the end of that first century is when it's written, or some point in that second half, 50 and beyond. This word klasmaton is used in the section of the Lord's Supper. And so these early Christians saw a nice connection here with that as well. So that's the feeding of the 5,000 in a quick nutshell, so to say. And so next time we'll take a look at the second half of the chapter, which is Jesus then walking on water. And to prepare for that, I encourage you to read John chapter 6. It's a wonderful parallel to what we have here in Matthew. John gives us a different scenario, tells us some other details that aren't in Matthew and in some of the other synoptics as well. And that really helps to give us an additional insight, understanding to the text here. So again, thank you for joining us for our text talk today. I hope you have a good rest of the weekend and that you join us for our virtual service then again on Sunday or in person if you are able to do so, to join us for that as well. Again, thanks.